A destitute mountain man thought he struck gold when a 71-year-old wealthy ranch heiress hand-picked him for marriage. It was supposed to be a simple transaction to secure her estate. But just 3 days after their vows, he forced open a locked cellar door and uncovered a terrifying, blood-chilling secret. The winter of 1887 had been unusually cruel to the Bitterroot Mountains. For Charles Hayes, a man who had carved his existence out of the unforgiving granite and pine of the high country, the freezing winds had brought nothing but empty traps and gnawing hunger. Charles was 32, his face weathered by sun and ice, his hands scarred from years of battling the wilderness. He owned nothing but his grandfather's repeating rifle, a rusted hunting knife, and the ragged wool coat on his back. By the time the spring thaw finally cracked the ice on the mountain creeks, Charles was starving. Desperation, a cold and hollow ache in his gut, drove him down from his solitary peak and into the bustling, mud-choked valley town of Red Creek. Red Creek was a booming cattle town teeming with drifters, outlaws, and opportunistic businessmen. Charles walked his emaciated mule down the main thoroughfare, ignoring the side-eyes, and whispered insults from the town's more civilized residents. He needed work. He needed a hot meal. What he found instead was a crowd gathered outside the sheriff's office, murmuring over a notice nailed to the wooden post. Charles pushed his way through the throng of murmuring cowboys and read the heavy parchment. It was an advertisement, though not for a bounty or a trail drive. It was a call for a husband. Daisy Caldwell, the 71-year-old matriarch of the Ironwood estate, the largest and most prosperous cattle ranch in the territory, was seeking a groom. The terms were blatantly transactional. The chosen man would receive immediate room board and a weekly stipend of $50. In exchange, he had to sign his name on a marriage certificate and live on the ranch. "She's finally lost her mind," muttered a passing ranch hand, spitting tobacco into the dust. "Or she's just trying to stick it to that snake of a nephew." Charles listened to the town gossip. Daisy's nephew Josiah Caldwell was a notorious gambler and a cruel man who had been circling his aging aunt like a vulture, waiting for her mind or body to fail so he could inherit her empire. Under the territory's convoluted property laws, if Daisy died without a spouse, Josiah could contest her will and seize the Ironwood ranch, tearing it apart to pay off his mounting debts. Daisy needed a legal shield. She needed a husband. For Charles, $50 a week was a king's ransom. It meant a warm bed, endless hot meals, and a roof that didn't leak melted snow. Driven by survival, he marched straight to the grand, imposing gates of the Ironwood estate. The mansion was a sprawling monstrosity of imported mahogany and stone, sitting atop a hill that overlooked thousands of acres of prime grazing land. When Charles was ushered into the parlor by a stiff, suspicious estate manager named Aidan Michael, he felt entirely out of place. He smelled of wood smoke and unwashed wool. The room smelled of expensive lavender and old money. Then Daisy Caldwell entered. She did not look 71. Though her silver hair was pulled back into a severe bun and deep lines etched her face, she carried herself with the terrifying grace of a mountain lion. Her eyes, a piercing, icy blue, locked onto Charles. She didn't flinch at his ragged appearance. "You're a long way from the peaks, mountain man," Daisy said, her voice sharp and steady, lacking any tremor of age. "I heard you were hiring," Charles replied, keeping his hat in his hands. "I'm not much for high society, ma'am. But I work hard, and I know how to keep my mouth shut." Daisy circled him slowly, her cane tapping rhythmically against the hardwood floor. "I don't need a worker. I have 60 men on my payroll for that. I need a wall between my legacy and my nephew. Aidan here," she gestured dismissively to the scowling estate manager, "thinks I should marry a banker. But bankers talk too much. Bankers have ambitions. I want a man who has nothing, expects nothing, and knows how to follow orders." "And what are the orders?" Charles asked. "You sign the papers. You move into the East Wing. You never interfere with the running of the ranch, and you do not speak to the press or the townsfolk about our arrangement. When I pass away, which, despite Josiah's prayers, won't be today, you will receive a lump sum of $50,000 and a train ticket to anywhere you desire. Do we have an agreement, Mr. Hayes?" Charles looked at the roaring fireplace, then at the lavish spread of food resting on a silver tray in the corner of the room. He thought of the freezing nights in the bitter roots. "Draw up the papers," Charles said. The wedding took place 2 days later in the dim, dusty office of the town judge. There was no music, no celebration, and certainly no romance. Charles wore a borrowed suit that pinched his broad shoulders, while Daisy wore a tailored black morning dress, a morbid choice that sent the local gossips into a frenzy. The only uninvited guest was Josiah Caldwell. He burst through the double doors just as the judge was finalizing the paperwork, his face flushed with rage and whiskey. "You old witch!" Josiah screamed, pointing a trembling finger at Daisy. "You think you can cheat me out of my blood right with this illiterate savage? I'll have the courts nullify this before the ink is dry." Charles instinctively stepped between Daisy and her nephew, his hand hovering near the heavy iron buckle of his belt. Josiah took one look at Charles's cold, hardened eyes and the violent scars on his neck and slowly backed away. "This isn't over," Josiah hissed before storming out into the muddy street. "Ignore him," Daisy said, calmly signing her name with a flourish. "He is a coward, and cowards only bark." That evening Charles officially moved into the Ironwood mansion. True to her word, Daisy gave him the entire east wing of the house. It was a lavish suite of rooms, filled with velvet drapes, feather mattresses, and porcelain basins. Yet despite the luxury, the house felt less like a home and more like a beautifully decorated tomb. The staff treated Charles like a ghost. They brought him meals in silence, refusing to meet his eyes. Aidan Michael, the estate manager, watched his every move with open hostility, lurking in the shadows of the long hallways. Charles was a man used to the deafening silence of the wilderness, but the silence inside the Ironwood estate felt heavy, suffocating, and unnatural. By the third day, the novelty of a warm bed and endless steak dinners began to wear off. Charles's survival instincts, honed by years of tracking predators in the snow, began to scream at him. Something was deeply wrong. It started with the noises. Late at night, Charles would hear muffled footsteps pacing above his ceiling in the supposedly empty attic. He heard whispered arguments between Daisy and Aidan in the drawing room, though the heavy oak doors muffled the words. Then came the warning. Charles was in the stables, brushing down his old mule, when Ezekiel Zeke Barnes, a grizzled ranch hand who had worked at Ironwood for 4 decades, cornered him. The old man looked terrified, glancing over his shoulder before he spoke. "You seem like a decent fella, Hayes." Zeke muttered, his voice barely a rasp. "So I'll tell you this once. Take a horse tonight and ride back to the mountains. Don't pack your bags, don't ask for your pay. Just ride." Charles frowned, putting down the brush. "I signed a contract, Zeke. I'm not running from a piece of paper or a bitter nephew." "It ain't the nephew you gotta worry about, son," Zeke whispered, his eyes wide with genuine fear. "Look around. You think you're the first stray dog the madam has taken in. You think Josiah is angry because this is a new trick. Get out before the moon turns." Before Charles could question him further, Aidan Michael's sharp voice rang out from the stable doors, ordering Zeke back to the fields. The old man practically sprinted away. That night, a violent thunderstorm rolled over the valley, masking the sounds of the house with deafening cracks of thunder. Sleep evaded Charles. Zeke's words echoed in his mind. You think you're the first stray dog unable to lie still. Charles lit a kerosene lantern and quietly left his room. He wandered the darkened halls of the East Wing, determined to understand what he had walked into. At the far end of the corridor, partially hidden behind a heavy tapestry, he noticed a narrow oak door. He had assumed it was a broom closet, but when he turned the iron handle, he found it firmly locked. Charles was no thief, but a mountain man knew how to pick a basic tumbler lock with a pocket knife and a piece of stiff wire. It took him 3 minutes to coax the lock open. The door clicked, swinging inward with a heavy creak. He raised his lantern, expecting to find forgotten winter coats or dusty furniture. Instead, he found a windowless, stone-walled room that looked like a private archive. The walls were lined with filing cabinets and heavy iron safes. In the center of the room sat a single wooden desk covered in neatly stacked ledgers. Charles walked over to the desk, wiping a thin layer of dust from the top leather-bound book. He opened it. It wasn't a financial ledger. It was a diary of sorts, written in Aidan Michael's precise, slanted handwriting. Charles traced his finger down the columns. There were names. William Thorne, married April 12th, 1875, deceased September 1st, 1875. Thomas Gray, married November 3rd, 1878, deceased February 14th, 1879. Samuel Higgins, married June 20th, 1882, deceased October 5th, 1882. Charles's heart hammered against his ribs as he turned the page. 6 names in total. 6 men. All drifters. All men with no families, no ties and no money. Just like him. And according to the ledger, every single one of Daisy Caldwell's previous husbands had died in a tragic, unexplained accident within exactly 4 months of their wedding day. Charles looked at the bottom of the right-hand page. The ink was still fresh. Charles Hayes. Married May 2nd, 1887. Projected conclusion. September 1887. A sudden chilling creak of a floorboard sounded directly behind him. Charles spun around his hand, flying to the hunting knife strapped to his thigh, and found himself staring into the cold, dead eyes of Aidan Michael, who was holding a double-barreled shotgun aimed squarely at Charles's chest. The twin barrels of the shotgun looked like 2 bottomless black pits in the dim, flickering lantern light. Aidan Michael's face was twisted into a cruel, triumphant sneer, his finger resting heavily on the double triggers. Curiosity, Mr. Hayes, is a luxury the poor cannot afford. Aidan hissed his voice, barely rising above the rolling thunder outside. You were supposed to be a quiet, simple brute. Eat your steaks, sleep in your silk sheets, and take a tumble off a horse come September. Now you've forced my hand. Charles didn't raise his hands. A mountain man facing down a grizzly didn't surrender, he calculated. His eyes darted from the heavy iron triggers to the distance between them, barely 4 feet. 6 men. Charles said, his voice terrifyingly calm, keeping his tone even to mask the adrenaline surging through his veins. 6 drifters dead in the dirt, and the townsfolk just looked the other way. The townsfolk of Red Creek work for Ironwood, Aidan replied smoothly, and the local sheriff is on a $500 a month retainer. We needed a firewall against Josiah Caldwell, but a firewall costs money. What you're holding in your hand, Mr. Hayes, is the price of doing business. Insurance. Charles realized the pieces snapping together. He had heard of such schemes in the mining camps, men taking out policies on disposable workers. The Mutual Life Insurance Company of New York, Aidan said with a chilling smile. We have a highly cooperative underwriter in Chicago. Every time Daisy takes a husband, a policy for $100,000 is quietly drawn up. When the husband meets a tragic, unavoidable demise on the ranch, Ironwood stays solvent for another 2 years. You were meant to pay off our debts to the Union Pacific Railroad. Aidan shifted his weight, preparing to fire. I'll tell the sheriff you caught Josiah trying to steal from the safe, and he shot you. It's a bit messy, but it will do. A deafening crack of thunder shook the stone walls of the archive room. At that exact fraction of a second, the lantern on the desk flickered. Charles moved. He didn't lunge forward. Instead, Charles swept his heavy leather boot upward, kicking the solid oak desk squarely into Aidan's knees. As the estate manager stumbled backward, the shotgun discharged the blast of buckshot, tearing a massive hole through the ceiling plaster instead of Charles's chest. Before Aidan could level the barrels for a second shot, Charles was on him. The mountain man closed the distance with the savage speed of a cornered wolf. He grabbed the hot barrel of the shotgun with his left hand, forcing it upward, while his right hand drove the heavy brass pommel of his hunting knife directly into Aidan's jaw. Bone crunched. Aidan's eyes rolled back into his head, and he collapsed to the floor like a sack of wet grain. Charles stood over him, breathing heavily, the smell of sulphur and burnt gunpowder stinging his nostrils. He didn't have much time. The gunshot would have woken the entire east wing. He grabbed a length of heavy curtain cord from the corner-bound Aidan's wrists and ankles with brutal, inescapable trapping knots, and shoved a rag into his mouth. Snatching the ledger off the desk, Charles stuffed it into the inside pocket of his wool coat. He needed to leave. He needed to saddle his mule and ride until the bitterroots swallowed him whole. But a burning, righteous anger rooted him to the floor. Daisy Caldwell had looked him in the eye and played the desperate, helpless widow. She had bought his life for $50 a week. Charles bypassed the stairs to the main floor and moved silently through the connecting corridors to the master suite. He didn't knock. He kicked the heavy mahogany doors open, his hunting knife gripped tightly in his fist. The room was illuminated by a roaring fire. Daisy Caldwell was sitting in a high-backed velvet armchair, fully dressed in her morning gown, sipping a glass of imported brandy. She didn't look surprised. She looked annoyed. "I take it Aidan's aim is failing him in his old age," Daisy said, her icy blue eyes locking onto Charles. "Aidan is tied up in your slaughterhouse of an archive," Charles growled, stepping into the room. "The ledger is in my coat. I know everything, Daisy. The insurance fraud, the murders. You're no victim. You're a butcher." Daisy took a slow, deliberate sip of her brandy. "Civilization is built on blood, Mr. Hayes. The mountains taught you that, didn't they? Only the strong survive. When my late husband died, he left Ironwood drowning in debt. The winter of '86 killed half our herds. The railroad barons were ready to carve up my land and leave me with nothing. So you started butchering poor men who had nobody to miss them," Charles spat. "I gave them a few months of paradise." Daisy snapped her facade, cracking for a moment, revealing the terrifying, desperate sociopath underneath. "I gave them fine wine, warm beds, and dignity. It was a fair trade for their worthless lives. And you were starving in the mud when I found you. I gave you purpose. You gave me a death sentence." "I can give you half," Daisy countered, smoothly leaning forward. $50,000, Charles. Real money. We blame the previous deaths on Aidan. We say he was embezzling and running a scheme behind my back. You testify you walk away rich, and I keep my ranch. A man like you doesn't care about justice. You care about survival." For a moment, the room was dead silent, save for the crackling fire. Charles looked at the old woman, realizing that the most dangerous predators didn't have fangs or claws. They had wealth and total lack of conscience. "I don't make deals with snakes," Charles said softly. "I crush their heads." Suddenly, the heavy oak doors of the bedroom splintered inward. Josiah Caldwell burst into the room, soaked in rain, his eyes wild and bloodshot. He was holding a Colt revolver, his chest heaving. He had heard the gunshot and seen his opportunity to finally take the estate by force. "I knew it!" Josiah screamed, pointing the gun erratically between Charles and Daisy. "I knew you two were plotting to cut me out. I heard the shot. It's over, Aunt Daisy. I'm putting an end to this tonight. I'll tell the sheriff the savage mountain man killed you, and I arrived just in time to avenge you." "Josiah, you fool, put the gun down," Daisy ordered, rising from her chair. Josiah didn't listen. He cocked the hammer and aimed at Charles's chest. Charles didn't wait for the trigger to pull. He dove toward the massive bay windows, wrapping his arms around his head. Josiah fired the bullet, tearing through the fabric of Charles's coat as the mountain man shattered the glass, plunging out into the raging thunderstorm and plummeting toward the veranda roof below. Charles hit the slanted wooden shingles of the veranda roof, hard rolling to absorb the impact. The rain was coming down in sheets, slicking the wood, but his instincts took over. He slid to the edge, dropped the remaining 10 feet into the muddy rose bushes below, and scrambled into the darkness. Behind him, he could hear shouting echoing from the mansion. Lanterns began to flare to life in the bunkhouses. Aidan had clearly been discovered by the ranch hands. "Hunt him down!" Aidan's voice boomed from a shattered window, raw and furious. $500 to the man who brings me his head. He stole from the safe." Charles didn't run for the stables. That's where they would expect him to go. He knew they would cut off the roads and telegraph the sheriff in Red Creek. Instead, Charles vanished into the dense, untamed pine forest that bordered the northern edge of the Ironwood estate. This was his world now. By dawn, a posse of 10 hardened ranch hands, led by a bandaged and bruised Aidan, Michael had tracked Charles into the timberline. They brought tracking hounds and lever-action rifles. They were confident, loud, and arrogant, believing they were hunting a frightened drifter. They didn't realize they were walking into a meat grinder. Charles had spent the night working in the dark. He had no gun, only his knife, his bare hands, and the environment. As the posse entered a narrow, rocky ravine, Charles struck. He didn't kill them. He incapacitated them with the ruthless efficiency of a trapper. The lead tracker stepped into a concealed rope snare made from wild vines, which whipped him upside down into the canopy, screaming. When 2 men rushed to cut him down, a massive deadfall trap, a log Charles had rigged with precise tension, swung down from the embankment, sweeping them off their feet and breaking their ribs. Panic set in among the posse. The hounds refused to track, whining and tucking their tails as the scent of the predator overwhelmed them. "Keep moving!" Aidan screamed, waving his revolver. "He's just one man." Charles materialized from the mud and ferns behind a straggling cowboy, clamped a hand over his mouth, and choked him into unconsciousness before dragging him into the brush. By noon, the posse of 10 was reduced to 3 terrified men, and Aidan huddled together in the pouring rain. "He ain't a man, Michael," one of the hands whimpered. "He's a ghost. I ain't dying for $500. The hands dropped their rifles and ran back down the mountain. Aidan was left alone, spinning in circles, firing blindly into the trees. "Show yourself, Hayes. You can't run forever." "I'm not running, Aidan," a voice echoed from the mist above. Aidan looked up just in time to see Charles drop from the branches of a towering Douglas fir. The mountain man landed squarely on Aidan, driving him face first into the mud. Charles pinned Aidan's arm behind his back, pressing the cold steel of his hunting knife against the manager's throat. "You're going to march?" Charles whispered, his voice like grinding stone. "Not back to the ranch. We're walking to Helena, to the capital." "Får du bestå kvartan ett år, For 3 grueling days, Charles force-marched Aidan Michael through the unforgiving wilderness, avoiding the main roads and the corrupt jurisdiction of Red Creek. They survived on roots and rainwater. Aidan stripped of his fine clothes, and his arrogance wept and begged, but Charles's resolve was absolute. On the 4th morning, a muddy-blooded Charles dragged Aidan up the steps of the territorial Capitol building in Helena and threw him at the feet of U.S. Marshal John Reynolds. Reynolds, a seasoned lawman who had long suspected the Ironwood estate of foul play, but lacked the evidence to raid it, listened in stunned silence as Charles produced the leather ledger. Insurance fraud across state lines, Reynolds muttered, flipping through the pages of dead men. Conspiracy to commit murder. Mail fraud with the Mutual Life underwriters in New York. Son, you haven't just caught a killer. You've brought down an empire. Within 48 hours, Marshal Reynolds and a detachment of 20 federal deputies, accompanied by agents from the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, descended upon the Ironwood estate. They found the mansion in chaos. Josiah Caldwell had attempted to seize control of the ranch in Aidan's absence, leading to a shootout with the remaining loyal hands. Both Josiah and Daisy were arrested in the parlor. When the federal marshals clapped iron cuffs on Daisy Caldwell's wrists, she finally looked her age. The regal, terrifying matriarch was reduced to a shivering, frail old woman. She looked out the window and saw Charles, sitting quietly on his mule watching the arrest. "I could have made you a king," she spat venomously as they dragged her away. "I prefer the mountains," Charles replied softly. The trial was the sensation of the decade in the Montana Territory. Governor Benjamin Potts himself ordered a full federal inquiry. The corrupt underwriter in Chicago was arrested. The Red Creek sheriff was stripped of his badge and imprisoned, and Daisy Caldwell was sentenced to hang, though she died of a sudden stroke in her cell before the execution could be carried out. Josiah was sentenced to 20 years in the territorial penitentiary for attempted murder. The Ironwood estate was seized by the federal government and auctioned off to pay the immense debts owed to the families of the murdered drifters whose graves were finally marked and honored. As the star witness and the man who broke the case, the Mutual Life Insurance Company, eager to avoid further public scandal, awarded Charles Hayes a staggering bounty of $10,000 in solid gold certificates. Marshal Reynolds offered Charles a badge, telling him the territory needed men with his grit and honor. But Charles politely declined. He bought a new saddle for his mule, a custom Winchester rifle, and enough supplies to last a decade. He rode out of Red Creek on a crisp autumn morning, turning his back on the mansions, the money, and the so-called civilized world. He looked up at the towering snow-capped peaks of the Bitterroots. The wilderness was brutal cold and unforgiving, but it was honest. And for Charles Hayes, that was the only wealth that truly mattered. Charles proved that no amount of money can outmatch the sheer will of a man fighting for his life. The Black Widow of Ironwood thought she was hunting a sheep, but she dragged a wolf right into her den. What did you think of Charles's brutal revenge? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you loved this wild western saga, smash that like button, share it with a friend, and subscribe for more incredible historical survival stories.